about with elasticity of demand, there's also an elasticity of supply. So after we've determined, or after we've begun looking at our willingness and ability to supply, we also want to look at how responsive producers or the sellers are going to be to changes in the price in the market. And so we can think about, for our first example here, Williams-Brice Stadium. So let's suppose that all of a sudden there's a large increase in the number of people who want to purchase football tickets. So everybody wants to go to the football games, much bigger increase, and the University of South Carolina knows if they make a bigger stadium, they could make more money. However, how easy is it for University of South Carolina to change the size of their stadium? It's incredibly difficult, right? We would either have to build a new stadium or we'd have to try and figure out some expansion. It would be so difficult to try to do that. And so the number of seats is virtually fixed, especially in the short run. So for this upcoming season, we have a very short time horizon, and we're not able to easily change the amount of seats we supply. And that's going to become very important when we start to think about sellers' responsiveness, their ability and their willingness to change the quantity that they supply as prices change. So it might not be that University of South Carolina isn't willing, but they don't have the ability to change the quantity that they produce. All right, so let's look at it in terms of some definitions here. So price elasticity of supply measures those producers or those sellers' responsiveness to price. So as the price changes, we know that sellers prefer higher prices. So as prices go up, do sellers produce more? And how much more do they produce? So producers are sometimes very price sensitive. And in that case, a small change in price will lead to a very large change in supply. But other times we're going to see that the producers don't change the quantity supplied, or they only make slight changes, and that's going to be that inelastic supply. So very similar terminology to what we had when we were thinking about demand. The big difference here is going to be in terms of, well, first off, who's price sensitive? So elastic supply, we're talking about producers. Elastic demand, we're talking about the consumers. But what the most important difference is, and what you might want to do on your notes, is make a chart, the determinants of elasticity of demand and the determinants of elasticity of supply. So supply has many fewer determinants, and there's actually only one main determinant. So, well, the first is how easy, the ability of firms to change. So something like a movie theater or the football stadium, it's very difficult for them to change the amount that they sell, right? We can't just create new seats. It's also going to be true of something like original artwork. We can't just create another Mona Lisa. And so we have producers or the sellers of the Mona Lisa are not very price sensitive. We can't just produce more Mona Lisas, so we have very inelastic supply when we have that inability to change the quantity we produce, even though there is a change in price. All right, so again, elasticity is then going to influence the slope of the supply curve. So time is the most important determinant of elasticity of supply. So we have the immediate period, the short run, and then the long run. So this is going to be the most important component of determining our price elasticity. Also, there are some items that are not very reproducible. So that's going to be something like the Mona Lisa that are going to have very inelastic supply. It's not going to be able to reproduce that product, and so there's only one, or there's a fixed number of those products available. All right, so let's start to look at the immediate market period. Okay, so let's suppose we have a product, and that product doubles in price. But immediately, what can the seller do? So let's, for example, think about something like a car dealership. So all of a sudden, a car's on the lot. So car dealership, they're selling cars, and all of a sudden, the value of their cars doubles in price. What can they do immediately? What can they do today? Well, they can virtually do nothing, right? There's a fixed number of cars on their lot. It's going to take a couple days for even something from a different lot to get there. And so they can't do anything, and the quantity we're going to see is going to be fixed. So let's suppose that that supply is fixed at 3 units, and what we're going to see is that it doesn't matter how high the price goes, the quantity that's available in the market is 3, and our supply curve is going to be perfectly inelastic. And again, that shape of that supply curve is going to be very similar, quantity, we have price, to a perfectly inelastic demand curve. So those curves are going to be very, very similar in this case. And so the amount that's available for sale is given. It's a fixed amount. It doesn't matter what the price is. Those sellers are going to sell 3 units. Okay, so this is in the immediate market period. Immediately think about right now, how can the seller change the amount that they produce? It's not very likely that they can, because they can't get a new shipment in. They can't just start producing more immediately. It takes time to do all of that. All right, so now let's move into the short run, so the in-between elasticity supply. So what we're going to see in the short run is that we start to gain a little bit of a slope, because producers have some ability to change the quantity that they're producing or the quantity that they're selling. So let's stick with our car dealership example, and let's say, so the price of cars doubles in this market, and there probably are a few extra cars sitting around at the factories that the firms can start to get in, and they can start to have a few extra, a little bit of extra supply around and available to them, but it's still they probably have a little bit of extra supply lying around, but it's probably not very much. And so that supply curve is still pretty steep. They still don't have too much of a change in their price too much of a change in their quantity as price changes. And then finally, when we hit the long run, we can think about now Ford, they expand their business, they have their work, they hire more workers, and now they're producing cars like crazy because the price of cars doubled. And so what we see then is that supply becomes even more elastic, okay? And we start to get an even flatter elastic slope. Okay, so what we're thinking about in terms of elasticity and slope, the steeper the slope, so a perfectly inelastic supply curve is going to have a very steep and vertical slope. And then as we move on into the short run, it becomes a little bit less steep. We start to have a little bit more of a slope there. And then when we get to the time period where we have the long run, then we start to have that flatter slope. And so the more your supply curve will look like that eye, remember, the more inelastic. And then as we're moving, as time goes on, our supply curves become more elastic. So as time goes by, we're going to start to see sellers have the ability to change the quantity that they produce more. So again, thinking about that car dealership, so let's suppose the car on the car lot chart, they cost $20,000. Well, if all of a sudden they jump up to $40,000, there's very little immediately today that that firm can do to try and get more cars on the lot. And so supply is very inelastic in that case. In the short run, we can start to see maybe they can get some cars from other lots. Maybe Ford can start to hire workers that'll work 24 hours a day, but they can't build new factories in the short run. The short run is just in a couple months, and they can't do too much. But in the long run, if prices stay at that $40,000, we can really see that those firms can make big changes in the quantities that they produce. All right, so time is the most important variable when we're thinking about determining elasticity of demand. All right, I want to go into a little bit more, not just on time, because we're going to assume time is the same for all of these, but which of the following items would have the most inelastic supply? So again, think about your determinants for supply. Supply is going to be what's most important here. Which ones can sellers have the greatest willingness and ability to change the quantity that they're producing? So boats, clothing, antiques, grocery items, or gasoline. And I hope you said antiques. Antiques has the most inelastic supply. They're not reproducible. You can't just all of a sudden start producing more antiques. It takes hundreds of years for something to be considered an antique. So what we're talking about is antiques. So boats as time goes on, clothing as time goes on, grocery items, gasoline, they can become more inelastic. So in terms of which would have the most inelastic demand, it would probably be, out of that case, something like grocery items or clothing. They're very broadly defined items, and they don't have a lot of substitutes. Gasoline would also be up there. Boats, not so much, probably considered a luxury item for most individuals. There are more substitutes for boats. It's easier to rent a boat than it is those other items. And so probably boats would have the more elastic demand. But when we're thinking about supply, inelastic supply, definitely antiques. All right, so hopefully that introduction to elasticity of supply was useful and helpful to you. And make sure that you go over, there's some extra practice in the practice problems and